The assessment vessel, Criterion 9, entered Earth's upper atmosphere at precisely the angle specified in the Galactic Defense Compact's operational manual, which overseer Denn-Varath had written himself 14 years ago, and which he considered one of his finer professional achievements. He had written the manual after his third assessment tour, when it had become clear to him that the Compact's existing documentation was dangerously vague on matters of procedural integrity. Other assessors, he had noted, approached evaluations with a troubling degree of subjectivity. They allowed themselves to be charmed by a species' cultural warmth, or impressed by raw biological novelty, or distracted by the sheer spectacle of a civilization doing something for the first time. Denn-Varath did not do these things. He assessed. He applied the 7 criteria. He filed the report. The Compact made the determination. That was the system, and the system was correct, and he was very good at it. He had completed 31 assessments. 22 species had passed. 9 had not. Of those 9, 3 had subsequently appealed, presented supplementary evidence, and achieved conditional approval on second review. Denn-Varath had not objected to those outcomes. The process allowed for appeal. The process was sound. He was not expecting Earth to be a problem. The briefing materials had described humanity as a Class 4 emerging civilization, biologically carbon-based, technologically mid-transitional, with a documented history of internal conflict that had, in the past 2 centuries, given way to a period of relative stabilization. They had launched objects into orbit. They had landed on their moon. They had developed rudimentary artificial intelligence and were in the early stages of atmospheric energy harvesting. By the standard profile, they were approximately 40 years behind the expected curve for galactic defense consideration. But the Compact's expansion committee had been under pressure to widen the net, and Earth had been flagged as a candidate worth evaluating. Denn-Varath had read all of this and formed a professional opinion, which was manageable. Not impressive, not concerning, just a standard assessment of a mid-transitional species that would likely receive a conditional pass with a list of development benchmarks and a follow-up evaluation in 15 years. He had been wrong before, but not often, and not like this. The landing coordinates had been provided by Earth's designated defense liaison, a bureaucratic entity called the Global Security Integration Office, which had communicated via text-based transmission in a language called English, and had seemed, in its responses, simultaneously overeager and vaguely confused about what was being asked of it. They had confirmed a landing zone, attached 17 documents of varying relevance, and then sent a follow-up message 12 minutes later that said simply, "Sorry, not that zone. Use the second set of coordinates. We had a scheduling conflict. Apologies for any inconvenience." It was the first time in 31 assessments that Denn-Varath had received an apology before he had landed. He noted this in his preliminary log. The landing zone turned out to be a flat expanse of cracked pavement at the edge of a large gray structure that the navigational system identified as a military installation. There were human vehicles parked in irregular rows. There were structures of varying states of maintenance. There was, on the far side of the landing zone, a flag on a pole, moving in the atmospheric current with the patient dignity of a symbol that had given up expecting anyone to notice it. No delegation had assembled. No formal receiving structure had been erected. There was no honor guard, no ceremonial arrangement, no rows of soldiers in pressed uniforms standing at disciplined attention in the manner that 48 of the 62 species Denn-Varath had ever assessed had managed to produce, regardless of how much warning they'd been given. There was one human. He was seated on an overturned container roughly 12 meters from where the Criterion 9 settled, legs spread, bent over something on the ground between his feet. He was young, extraordinarily young by the look of him, with the soft, unfinished quality that carbon-based species tended to exhibit before full biological maturity. He wore a uniform of sorts,
olive drab and slightly wrinkled, with a patch on the shoulder that Denn-Varath's visual scanner identified as indicating a rank equivalent to approximately the third tier of military structure, which was to say, not a high tier. He had close-cut dark hair and a face that had not yet committed to its adult configuration.
On the ground between his feet was a drone, or what had been a drone. It was currently in approximately 11 pieces, spread across a cloth that had also been repurposed, apparently, as a workbench. The human was bent over it with a tool of some kind, making small, precise movements, occasionally pausing to push something into position, and then lean back and assess the result with narrowed eyes. Beside him, on the overturned container, was a cylindrical metal vessel. The scanner identified it as an energy drink, a human consumable combining caffeine, sugar, and several compounds with effects on the human nervous system. It was, according to the readout, the third such vessel in the immediate vicinity. 2 were empty and had been set aside. The third was partially consumed. Denn-Varath stood at the base of the landing ramp for 8 full seconds before the human looked up. He did not look startled. He looked at Denn-Varath with the expression of someone noting a new variable in an equation they were already managing. His gaze traveled up. Denn-Varath was taller than most humans by a significant margin, and his assessor's uniform carried the visual weight of institutional authority. And then back down, and then back up again with a more considered look. "You the compact assessor?" he said. "I am Overseer Den-Varath, representing the Galactic Defense Compact's Assessment Division. I am here for the evaluation of Earth's candidacy for—" "Yeah, okay, cool." The human returned to the drone. "I'm Specialist Okafor, Jesse Okafor. Sorry about the—" He gestured broadly with his tool, a gesture that encompassed the drone, the pavement, his general presence, possibly the entire planet. "We had a situation." Den-Varath descended the ramp. He had a questionnaire. He always had a questionnaire. It contained 214 items, organized across 7 categories, and completing it in the correct order was, in his professional opinion, the backbone of a defensible evaluation. He activated the first page. "Specialist Okafor, I will need to speak with your commanding officer. Colonel Reyes is in a briefing." Jesse Okafor did not look up. "She said to get you settled and she'd be out in—" He checked the device on his wrist. 40 minutes, maybe less. "I will need to observe your active defense infrastructure." "Yeah, this is kind of it right now." Another vague gesture at the drone parts. "We've got 3 others in the air, but Sentinel-4 had a control board issue, and I'm trying to—" He paused, inserted something into the drone's interior with careful deliberateness, and held it for a moment. "I'm trying to fix it." "With that tool," Den-Varath said. "Pocketknife, yeah." And he looked at the secondary object in the human's other hand. "That? Electrical tape." Jesse Okafor said it with the tone of someone confirming that yes, the sky was blue, and what of it? Den-Varath stood in the middle of the landing zone on a planet he had traveled 4 light transit cycles to reach, holding a questionnaire with 214 items, looking at a teenager on his 3rd energy drink, fixing an advanced surveillance drone with a pocket knife and electrical tape, and experienced a sensation he did not have an immediate classification for. He opened his log and added a notation. "Primary contact established. Assessment initiated. Preliminary observations. Significant." He left the word significant because the alternatives that came to mind were not suitable for an official document. He sat down. There was another overturned container nearby, and he did not want to stand in the middle of the landing zone, reading a questionnaire while a 19-year-old ignored him. So he sat, and pulled up the first category of items, and attempted to begin. "Specialist Okafor. Category 1. Organizational command structure.
Can you describe the chain of command for Earth's designated military response forces?
Jesse had something in his mouth. Denn-Varath's scanner identified it as a small length of electrical tape he had bitten off the roll and was temporarily storing. His hands were occupied. He answered around it. Colonel Reyes runs integrated defense. She reports to Joint Command, which is... It's complicated, honestly, because it's still technically multinational, and some of the older command structures didn't fully merge after the Consolidation Act. So there are like 3 parallel chains depending on which sector you're talking about. But for practical purposes, Reyes is the person. He extracted the tape piece from his mouth and applied it to something inside the drone. His hands were small and moved with a focused precision that Denn-Varath, despite himself, observed with involuntary attention. Category 1, Item 2, Denn-Varath continued. Standardized deployment capability. How quickly can Earth mobilize a response force to a designated threat coordinate? Depends on the threat level and the theater. High priority incursion, we can have assets moving in. Jesse tilted his head. For atmospheric coverage, maybe 8 minutes from alert. Ground assets, longer. We're still working on the rapid response integration. The software's got a latency problem at the handoff point between the regional hubs. A latency problem? Yeah, it's a known issue. We've got a patch in development. He picked up the energy drink, took a long sip without pausing his work on the drone, and set it down. It'll be fixed before the evaluation window closes. Denn-Varath marked the item. He was not certain which box to mark it in. He moved to Item 3. Defense infrastructure redundancy. In the event of a primary system failure, describe the secondary and tertiary response protocols. Jesse Okafor stopped working. He set his pocketknife on his knee, pushed his hands through his hair, a human gesture that Denn-Varath's behavioral database identified as associated with mild cognitive exasperation, and then looked up at the sky for a moment with the expression of someone silently negotiating with their own patience. Okay, he said, to the sky, or to Denn-Varath, or to both. Look, I can answer all of these, and I will, because Colonel Reyes will be out in a bit, and she'll go through the full brief with you. And she has slides. She really likes slides. But I'm asking, like genuinely asking, if I can keep working on this while we do the questions, because Sentinel-4 is supposed to be covering the eastern grid, and right now that grid has a gap, and I don't love having a gap. Denn-Varath looked at him. You are concerned about a gap in your surveillance coverage. I'm always concerned about gaps in coverage. Jesse Okafor picked his pocketknife back up. That's the job. Denn-Varath noted something in his log. Not for the record, or not for the official record, for himself. A small marker that he could not yet categorize, but did not want to lose. He continued down the questionnaire. Jesse continued working. The answers came back fragmentary, technically literate, occasionally preceded by pauses in which Jesse appeared to be deciding how much honesty was appropriate. Not evasion, Denn-Varath noted, but calibration. The kind of measured disclosure that experienced officers performed reflexively, and which was not, in the assessor's experience, something you could train into someone who didn't already have it. What Jesse Okafor clearly did not have was a drone in working condition. 3 more attempts to seat the control board had each produced a brief moment of apparent success, followed by a small light that blinked red twice and then stopped. After the 3rd attempt, Jesse leaned back on his container, looked at the drone, and produced a sound from somewhere in his chest that Denn-Varath's translator identified as a sigh of the resigned rather than the defeated variety. I need to check something, he said, stood up, walked to the gray building, disappeared for approximately 4 minutes, and returned carrying a small component wrapped in what appeared to be a square of a different kind of tape. He sat back down, examined the component,
compared it to what was currently in the drone, swapped them, reached for his pocket knife, and returned to work as though the interruption had not happened.
"You went to retrieve a replacement component," Den-Varath observed. "Yeah." Jesse examined his work. The original had a hairline fracture in the relay housing. You can't see it without magnification, but it was causing the voltage drop. He glanced up. "I found it by touch, actually. I was running my thumb over the surface and there was a catch." He demonstrated briefly in the air with his thumb. 0.5 millimeter, maybe less. "You identified a component fault by tactile sensation." Jesse seemed to think about whether this was a significant statement. "I've been working on these boards for 2 years, he said finally, with the particular flatness of someone who has never considered their own competence especially remarkable. "You get a feel for them."
The drone came to life. Not loudly, it cycled through its startup sequence with a series of low tones. The rotors made a brief test rotation. A small cluster of status lights shifted from red to amber to green in orderly succession. And then it lifted off Jesse Okafor's improvised workbench cloth, rose to a hover at approximately knee height, and waited.
Jesse looked at it for a long moment. Then he took out the device on his wrist, input a sequence, and watched the drone rise to operational altitude and bank smoothly toward the eastern grid. He watched it for approximately 15 seconds after it was out of sight. Then he picked up his energy drink, finished it, set the empty vessel with the other 2, and looked at Den-Varath. "Okay," he said. "What was the next question?" The assessment continued. Colonel Reyes arrived 43 minutes later, with slides and several other officers, and the kind of assembled institutional presence that Den-Varath had expected to begin with. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s, with the bearing of someone who had been in authority for long enough that she no longer needed to perform it. And she took his hand, a human contact greeting that he had read about, but which was still mildly surprising in practice, and said, "Overseer, I apologize for the reception. We had an incident with the eastern grid." "I am aware," Den-Varath said. "Specialist Okafor informed me." Reyes glanced at Jesse, who had gathered his cloth and his tools and his 3 empty energy drink vessels, and was standing nearby with the posture of someone who was present, but trying not to be, like a piece of furniture that was self-conscious about the attention. She looked back at Den-Varath with a professional expression that contained, just barely, the echo of a private amusement. "He take good care of you?" "He answered my preliminary questionnaire," Den-Varath said, "while repairing a drone, with a pocket knife and electrical tape." "He's good at that," Reyes said, without a trace of apology. "I observed." They moved inside. The brief was thorough and, in several respects, impressive. Earth's integrated defense architecture was more sophisticated than the mid-transitional profile suggested, and Reyes walked through it with the organized confidence of someone who had spent years making a complicated thing comprehensible to people who needed to fund it. The slide about response time made Den-Varath revise 2 of his preliminary marks. The slide about the AI integration made him revise a 3rd. But he kept returning, in the way of someone trying not to the landing zone outside. He had 31 assessments in his record. He had seen reception ceremonies of extraordinary formal complexity. He had been met by heads of state, by high commanders, by honor guards in full ceremonial dress. He had been presented with cultural artifacts, given tours of flagship facilities, shown the most impressive things each civilization had to offer. This was standard. Species undergoing assessment understood the stakes and performed accordingly. Earth had sent him a 19-year-old with a pocket knife. He could not determine, as he sat through Reyes's briefing and processed the information with the methodical competence he brought to every evaluation, whether this was the most disqualifying thing he had ever seen or the most clarifying. That evening, in his vessel, he completed the assessment report. He had done this 31 times. It had never taken more than 3 hours. He sat with the Earth file for 6 hours and 40 minutes, which was a record of a kind he had not anticipated setting. The problem was not the data. The data was clear, and in several respects it was damning, and his professional obligation was to report it accurately, and so he did. Earth's command structure had redundancies that had not been fully integrated. Their response latency had a documented software fault that had not been resolved at the time of assessment. Their primary surveillance asset in the eastern grid had been non-operational for 40 minutes during the evaluation window, repaired using informal tools by a single junior specialist working alone. Their formal reception protocol was essentially non-existent, and their assessment liaison had communicated the wrong landing coordinates before the evaluation began.
He wrote all of it. He wrote it carefully and completely, and with the same structured precision he brought to every report. He cited the criteria, noted the deficiencies, and appended his recommendation. He also wrote the other things, the things that didn't have standard fields in the assessment template, which he put in the supplementary observations section and took particular care with. He wrote about the field of the drone's relay housing under a thumb moving at 0.5 millimeter of crack in the dark. He wrote about the eastern grid gap and a 19-year-old who described his concern about it with the flat, unglamorous certainty of someone who understood that gaps had consequences and did not require an audience to find them unacceptable. He wrote about 3 energy drink vessels lined up with a neatness that was apparently automatic, and a pocketknife replaced in its pocket with the same automatic precision, and eyes that tracked the repaired drone out of sight for 15 seconds before returning to the questionnaire, because the job was the drone, and the drone was now done, and then the job was the questionnaire. He wrote about the calibration, the decision about how much honesty was appropriate, and noted that it was not the calibration of inexperience covering for ignorance, but the calibration of someone who understood the difference between what a record needed to contain and what the actual truth was, and who had made a considered choice about which one to give. He filed the report. He marked his recommendation clearly. He closed the file and sat in the dark for a while and thought about the concept of readiness, which had always seemed to him a state that was achieved or not achieved, a threshold that was crossed or wasn't, a preparation completed or left incomplete. He thought about a drone in pieces on a cloth on cracked pavement, and a gap in the eastern grid, and the shape of someone's attention when the thing they were responsible for finally lifted off and went where it was supposed to go. In the morning, he sent the filed report to the Compact's evaluation board and did not sleep well before he did. The response came 42 hours later. He was 3 light transit cycles into the return journey when the message arrived, and he read it twice to confirm it said what he thought it said, which was that the board had reviewed his assessment of Earth, noted his recommendation with interest, reviewed the supplementary observations section, and issued a determination of conditional galactic defense approval, pending benchmark review in 10 years. Conditional approval. He had recommended denial. His report had been, in 31 assessments, the most technically unfavorable he had ever filed. He had documented a software fault and a structural redundancy gap and a surveillance failure and an informal tools repair on active military equipment, and a reception that consisted of 1 person and 3 empty energy drink cans. He looked out at deep space for a while, at the stars that did not care about assessment criteria or recommendation thresholds, or the 7 categories of the Galactic Defense Compact evaluation form, which he had written himself 14 years ago. In a period of confident clarity he was finding slightly difficult to access from his current vantage point. He pulled up the report and looked at the supplementary observations section one more time, the part the board had, apparently, also read. He had ended that section with a single paragraph, which he had almost deleted because it didn't feel like the language of an official document, but which he had ultimately left in because it was the truest thing he'd written
and he had, after 6 hours and 40 minutes with the file, run out of reasons to take it out. He had written, "The species does not appear to understand that it should be less prepared. Its junior personnel operate with a continuity of attention that does not appear to require institutional reinforcement. Its systems fail, and its personnel fix them with the materials available. Its formal structures are incomplete, and its informal competence is, by observable evidence, filling the gap. I do not know how to score this against the criteria. I know what it looks like." He read that paragraph. He put the report down. He was, by his own standards, obligated to be troubled by the board's decision. He had written a denial recommendation, and they had issued approval, which was an outcome he could, if he chose, take as an institutional failure to apply the criteria correctly. He found that he did not choose to. What he chose, sitting in the dark of the Criterion 9 with the stars outside, and the report on the panel before him, and the memory of a drone rising steadily toward the eastern grid with its status lights all green, was something closer to the satisfaction of a thing correctly identified, a thing he had spent 6 hours and 40 minutes looking for the right category for, and which had turned out not to need a category because it was, in fact, its own thing. He had 32 assessments in his record now, 23 passes, 9 denials, 1 conditional approval that he had recommended against. He opened a new document and began writing notes for the second edition of the Galactic Defense Compact's operational manual, which he had been meaning to update for several years and which he now felt, with some clarity, needed a new section. The section would be about readiness, about what it was and what it was not, and where it actually lived in a species. Not in the ceremony of preparation, not in the architecture of command, but in the part of a person that finds a hairline fracture by feel, and does not consider this remarkable, and watches the fixed thing leave, and does not look away until it is where it is supposed to be. He didn't have a title for the section yet. He would think of one.